Okay, let's make a start. So first of all, thank you all for coming. I keep hearing this expression zoomed out, but clearly that's not the case with you guys. So thank you very much for coming to the Leaving Lockdown public debate, exploring issues of privacy, trust, community and human rights. And this is to give you an initial insight into what we learned from the project. Lucy, are you? Oh, thank you. So who we are. So the team that worked on this project are Traverse, an independent research and engagement consultancy who worked on delivering the deliberative process. And then the Ada Lovelace Institute, an independent research organisation focusing on data and AI, and they worked on the content and the subject expertise. An online engagement service, Bang the Table, who provided online engagement platform, Engagement HQ. And I guess where I sit, although I wasn't involved in the project itself, is I'm an associate of Involve, which is an independent public participation organisation, and Involve's role was to provide challenge and feedback on the process. So I've already introduced myself, Diane, and oops, what happened there? And as well as hearing from the organisations that are involved, Jonathan at Bang the Table, Rima at Ada Lovelace, and Anna, Lucy and Duncan from Traverse, we're also going to hear what I think is really important and very often forgotten, is to hear from somebody who took part in the debate. And it's a perspective that's really crucial to understanding how well the process worked. We're all new to doing loads of things online, or a lot of us are fairly new. So hearing from Caroline is going to be really important. And then there's you guys, a mix of people from all sorts of backgrounds. And then what we're going to do today, I'm going to shut up in 1 minute, and we're going to hear presentations from the three people that I mentioned, three organisations who were closely involved. There will be time for Q&A. It will be quick. There are a lot of you. We won't be able to take questions from all of you. So note down your questions. I think you have Google Docs, is that right? For the questions, or chat?
The chat would be great.
Chat. So note down your questions in the chat, and then one of the Traverse team will be collating those, and we'll get to those about 1 o'clock. And then there will be a breakout discussion. You will get put into breakout rooms. For those who haven't used Zoom before, this is an entirely painless experience. And we're talking about something which is really important, I think, and really interesting from an engagement practitioner's perspective, is what is it like to run engagement on a live social issue where the ground is uncertain, everything's changing really quickly, you know, there's loads of factors, there's politics, there's science, there's economics, there's people's lives, there's schooling, you know, it's a really complex social issue, and feeding into immediate policy cycles and needs. So that's an important discussion. And then we will have a brief plenary, and then we will close. So using Zoom, again, for if you're not familiar with it, children pets, anything that interrupts your frame, I suppose, are always welcome. I have a cat that wanders about occasionally. If there's a problem, use the chat. And Lucy will pick that up, and we can sort things out technically. If you can put yourself on mute when you're not speaking, it helps to eliminate background noise. Raise your hand if you want to say something, and allow everybody time to speak. So Our first speaker is going to be Anna, who's going to talk us through the method and the process. So over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Diane. And I'm actually going to immediately defer to Rima because we're just going to start off by quickly framing what we did here from both of our organisations' perspectives. So Lucy, if you want to just pop onto the next slide. Just from an Ada Lovelace perspective, Rima is just going to talk very quickly about why they were interested in doing this and why it was important.
Yeah, so we're an organisation that aims to ensure that data and AI work for people in society, and public engagement is a really core part of the way we operate, the way we understand public perspective and reflect that in policy making. So that's a really important point to put into context. And we had a particular challenge, which is when moving into lockdown, it was very clear that decisions were being made rather rapidly about the way technology was affecting people's lives. And it was also really clear that some of the more traditional approaches that we use were going to be incredibly difficult to do. So, you know, we've worked in partnership with Understanding Patient Data and Hopkins Van Mill on health data citizen juries, and we've also been doing a lot of work on biometric technology. But it also felt that public engagement was really important, so it mattered. We couldn't explore that through our usual approach, and we felt the need to respond in an agile way. And I have to give a lot of credit to Traverse, who very much approached us, and we've been able to work together quite collaboratively off the back of our report called Exit Through the App Store in order to convene this discussion and debate. I'm really interested to hear from everyone else, so I'm not going to say any more. Anna,
thanks, Rima. Great. And just quickly from a Traverse perspective, it was very similar for us. We thought it was really important at this time to listen to the public, and we didn't see that it was being done that much. We wanted to experiment, and we really wanted to collaborate. We wanted to work with people we'd not worked with before, and we thought it was a good opportunity to do so. So Lucy, if you could move on to the next slide for our objectives. These were the things, mildly ambitious objectives that we were trying to achieve. We're only going to be talking about 3 and 4 today. The objectives 1 and 2, which are much more to do with the actual research content, we're going to be covering in a webinar on Thursday, same time, that Rima's going to be leading and Ada Lovelace are hosting. We're going to be focusing on the deliberation in a kind of timely, policy relevant timescales online for an asynchronous process today. So I'm going to whiz through this really quickly. If you can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Lucy, that's fine. The structure, the way we did it, if you look at the bottom line here, I'll talk to that in more detail. So we designed a process whereby each Thursday, a group of participants, so we're 28 of them in total, recruited from 2 locations, got together to, on a Thursday, all together for a plenary session with some specialists, usually 1 or 2 specialists, and we ran a 90-minute Zoom session which had Q&A through chat. Ended up being very rich sessions. Then after that, we set some activities to be completed on the Engagement HQ platform. This was a mixture of idea generation, polls, journaling, different types of things that were related to what we had just presented from the specialists, so the information we've been sharing. And on the following Monday, the participants got together in smaller groups of 8 for deliberation. And they were talking and discussing about what they'd learned the previous week and the activities, other things that had come to mind. And we repeated that structure 3 times over a 3-week process. And then finally, at the end, we did a final session where we got together. We looked at some of the emerging findings with participants. We did some consolidation, rationalization, prioritization together to try and bring us towards some kind of conclusion for the project. So we worked with 5 specialists over the course of the project. And we focused broadly on exit strategy technologies. But what we tried to do was also move between looking at the sort of detail of these lockdown strategies, but also the underlying values and principles around people's reactions to those as well. So the big question was, did it work? Which the next slide will tell you a little bit about. And we had 4 tests for ourselves. So we were looking at these 4 questions to try and figure out whether or not we thought this had gone well. The first one, was it inclusive? Well, up to a point. So we recruited a sample of participants who were broadly reflective of key demographics of the national population. Now, our reflection on doing this, and we've thought about this a lot over the last few weeks, is that any type of engagement includes some and excludes others. and this process was run online, so it excluded people who weren't online. However, some participants told us that they wouldn't have actually taken part if it had been face-to-face. So it equally included people who would have been excluded in a face-to-face process. And our overall takeaway from this, and other things that I'll talk about in a minute, is that conversations about inclusion cannot be just about the medium and the platform, and they have to be bigger conversations about how our engagement structures and processes overall as what we're doing as practitioners can be exclusory, and how we interrogate that more fully. That's a bigger conversation. I don't have so much time to get into it now, so I'll have to leave it there for now. Was it deliberative? Well, there's loads of limitations and caveats, but overall we were really pleased with the quality of the conversations participants were having. And so it felt different being in a room, but it was still definitely deliberative. Did it work online? Well, we never met. None of us ever met in person. The teams planning it, the participants, we never met. Everything was done online. We collaborated in the partnership through Teams and email, and we run everything on Zoom and Engagement HQ for the actual process. And was it as rapid as policy? We did everything. We went from the idea of this to findings in 10 weeks. So in comparison to a normal deliberative process, it felt quite fast. One thing to mention on that is the limitation we had is that we were moving so quickly that the information wasn't keeping up with us. We just didn't have answers for participants. Things were changing so rapidly. And because we were independent, we weren't doing this within government, we couldn't provide those answers. It was an advantage because it meant we could be completely transparent, but it meant we didn't have access to things that weren't in the public domain. So in order to think a little bit more deeply about the process and to talk you through some of the things that we thought worked and some things we would have done differently, if you can move to the next slide, Lucy, we've spread these out across 4 key areas that we think are important in any deliberation. The first being a learning experience, the second being long form and reflective, the third hearing a diversity of voices, and the fourth exploring consensus but embracing complexity. And I'm briefly going to talk about what worked and what we would have done differently for each of these areas. So in terms of the learning experience, we actually found that this was we really enjoyed doing this online. We thought it worked really well. The plenary worked really well with specialists giving information. The chat function was great for those people who are usually nervous to ask questions verbally. Being able to post slides and the notes and the videos on Engagement HQ for people to then watch again afterwards and look at afterwards to really embed their learning was really helpful for a lot of participants. They told us that in the feedback. So in terms of being able to share information well, we thought we did this quite well. We thought it worked quite well. Obviously, lots of things we'd still do differently. Ideally, we'd circulate the materials up front so some participants actually asked for this so that they could look at the materials and prepare the questions they wanted to ask specialists. We would have been more creative with developing videos. We would have had more interaction on the Engagement HQ platform. We would have had specialists on there answering participant questions. There's loads of things we could have done to enrich it further, but it broadly worked well.
And I did wonder whether we wanted to keep them and give them right back.
Sorry, I just think there might be a bit of background noise there. Thank you. Moving on to being long form and reflective, which is the next slide. Thanks, Lucy. So what worked well for us was that we did this in a kind of what we called a distributed structure. So we didn't do everything over half a day or a full day. And we quite liked that because it gave time for reflection in between sessions, which we felt really supported the deliberative process. And it also to provide people with multiple different ways of contributing, which we learned from participant feedback helped with different ways of working and preferences for working styles and contribution. And the asynchronous engagement was also good for that as well. People could do it in their own time when it felt right for them. And that supported this reflective process, even though we were doing it in a very tight time scale. So those are some of the things that went well. One thing that would be a big change is that we only gave 60 minutes for the discussion session, partly because we didn't want to increase the time so it was too much of a time commitment for participants, but it was way too short. I mean, we needed a good 90 minutes for those deliberative discussion sessions, and actually participants told us that themselves, but we were just getting into it sometimes when we had to stop. We would have probably added a chat forum to support the reflection, and we would have loved to run telephone interviews as well with participants in order to encourage the reflective process. In terms of hearing a diversity of voices, which is the next thing I'll talk about, I've mentioned this a little bit already, but I'll just give you a few sort of stats in terms of what happened. We recruited 31 participants, and 28 out of them went through the whole process, which we were pleased with in terms of retention. And as I said, it was a broadly reflective sample. We did ask participants for their feedback on what barriers they had to participating, and if there are any times where they felt that they couldn't participate fully. And the times when this happened was when people had Wi-Fi issues, or when there was some issue with their connection. So obviously, online does provide a barrier that needs overcoming, but none of those instances meant that people dropped out of the process. They were just usually one-off bits that were a bit of a problem and needed resolving. So there are kinks, but ways of overcoming that. Things that we would do differently, we would have loved to do this across more locations, and we would have really obviously wanted to do much more digital onboarding, identifying potential participants for digitally excluding, sending out tablets that are data enabled and supporting them in a digital onboarding process to enable participation. That would have been great. We just wasn't within the scope of this experimentation. And also something that we'd like to think about is how our representative sampling could be interrogated to see if that is actually the best way of including all the voices that need to be heard, and are there other ways of thinking about sampling that actually are more equal and are more just. And finally, as I'm racing through these, I hope I'm not too much over time, we looked at this idea of embracing complexity and exploring consensus. And from a personal perspective, I found the consensus to be the hardest to achieve within this project. Because usually when working in a room as a facilitator, I do probably do a lot of this through feel. Whereas within this process, you can't do it in the same way. You have to design it and structure it, which in some ways maybe makes it more thoughtful and more intentional. So there are advantages to that. One thing we did to help get at this, both the complexity and consensus, was try and focus on the values, ideas, and the key questions that were underpinning a lot of our conversations really helped. And using one example of an exit strategy as a way of digging deeper into that was quite helpful. Things that we do differently, if we could have shared the emerging findings early with participants so they could look at them and comment on them, found a way to enable that so that there was more co-creation of the findings, that would have been ideal. We just didn't quite get to that within the structure of the event. And a final thought from me is that I think doing this project did make us rethink a number of our assumptions, including about what deliberation is and what it can be, and what inclusion is and what it should be. And we really don't have answers to all of these things. We've framed some questions for ourselves which will influence how we work going forwards. But one of the things that we wanted this project to contribute was that it would be part of these wider discussions on how best we involve the public in decision making at times of national crisis like this, and what are the things that we need to consider. So mainly we hope that some of what we've done and we're presenting today will spark ideas and debate, and we're really excited to hear what you think and hear about some of your experiences as well. And I will leave it there and hand it back to Diane.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was really interesting, and I think your points about inclusion and exclusion not being channel dependent, but actually much wider than that, is a really, really important one. And a question of what deliberation is as well. Really interesting to have further conversations about that. So we are going to hear from Jonathan. I'm just going to give Jonathan an alert. Anna was a little bit over time. If we want to allow for questions, if you can be as succinct as you possibly can, that would be good, Jonathan.
Certainly. Hello, everyone. How long? What do you want? 3 minutes?
Oh, if you can do that, fantastic.
I'll do my best. We wanted just to give you a quick feel for the platform. So I'm sure the slides will be circulated, but one aspect of Engagement HQ are the dialogue tools, which you can see in front of you here, from a very open environment through discussion forums, ideas, tools and places, down to something that you'll be more familiar with through surveys and quick polls. And in the middle, you've got the ability to integrate storytelling, so the power of stories. We have a guest book facility, which you can use as a kind of a graffiti wall that you could imagine happens in a face-to-face event. And then there's a question and answer tool, which you can use for questions and answers, but they don't have to happen. Everyone doesn't have to be there at the same time, so it's more asynchronous. And so the real short version of this is that you can turn them on and off, like the old British gas advert. They're turn on and offable as and when you want to use them. So you're trying to replicate what we've done face-to-face in the past, which is do the right method for the right audience at the right time, all those sorts of things, using the different tools at your disposal. That's supported by the next slide, hopefully, if that's all right, Lucy. Which really helps with the deliberative side of this. So you're creating that learning environment through a range of tools here, which I really haven't got enough time to talk you through, but all these different widgets enable you to add the learning, the information, FAQs, all sorts of things to create that. I talk of it as a safe environment for online participation, so that people feel that they've almost walked into a room where there's support, there's information, there's moderation, and all of those things. So you put that all together. Next slide, please. And that's supported, those two aspects of Engagement HQ that are then actually supported by an analysis aspect of the platform, but also a participant database, so you can keep in touch with people, send them newsletters, etc., etc. You can identify people that may have dropped out of the process, and so on and so forth. In this particular instance, we created a private pages for the projects, so that obviously people felt that they could talk to each other without everybody seeing what they were saying. And they had all these widgets around them to help them take part in weekly project activities. And there's a screenshot there which gives you a little bit of a feel for what was going on. So next slide. In this instance, we turned on the ideas board, journal activities, quick polls, and the Q&A. And you can see on the right hand on the screen there the ideas board. People putting up their ideas, and they can comment on them and give them a love heart if they like them. As Anna's already said, it would have been great if we could have integrated some of the other things like the discussion forums, but at the same time we didn't want to overload people in terms of what was a new experience for the participants, so we didn't want to give them too much to do. Although I did see one of the comments in the evaluation was it would have been nice to do some more, so that was, that's quite encouraging. Next slide. And is that me? No, not me. So there you go. That was it. That's a quick overview. Very fast.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Much appreciated. So this gives us a little time to talk with Carolyn, who took part in this project. Carolyn, I've got a series of questions for you. Are you okay to answer?
Yep.
Good. First of all, why did you decide to take part in this project?
Well, the whole topic of coming out of lockdown was something I had quite strong feelings about. So I thought it'd be interesting to have an opportunity to share those with other people who might come from different perspectives. I think that was really the main motivation for joining. Although one of the reasons that I think we all stayed engaged, almost all of us, was the really excellent quality of the expert presentations. So we felt that we were getting something quite privileged by being there in a small group, able to ask questions of them.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you, Carolyn. I think you've probably anticipated some of my the response to the next question. Very often you have a choice, do we do this online or do we do this face-to-face, but circumstances dictated that it had to be online. So what was it about the project that worked, about the process of the project that worked well, and what worked less well from your perspective?
I think dealing with the content, you can see from those stories that we were asked to write stories about coming out of lockdown that were actually nothing to do with the use of technology. They were sort of masks and bubbles and things. So I felt it was a bit unclear really what this was all about. I felt I was getting mixed messages, but the majority of it did focus on the use of different technologies to support coming out of lockdown. So that was one thing. The other thing was we did focus very much on the tracking app, and the tracking app was going all over the place in the 3 weeks that we were on the course. You know, first it was going to be the thing that would save us all, and then by the end it was kind of, well, probably it doesn't work, and so it's not really very important at all. So that was quite strange. The actual subject matter I felt was very unstable. I think I'd agree with Anna that if we'd had a bit more time in the small groups, we might have got more of a rich consensus. As it was, Anna was very good at pushing us to choose between things where, you know, we probably thought they were all important, but she said, no, you've got to choose one. So that, I think that did lead to some kind of consensus, even if it wasn't as considered as it might have been if we'd had more time.
Okay, and was there anything in particular about the Engagement HQ platform that you found particularly valuable as part of the project?
I didn't really make maximum use of it. So I think the answer would be, it was obviously useful to have the polls and to see how people's opinions had changed. As I say, I think the story application slightly sent us off on a wrong track, because it seemed to be talking about different issues from what the presentations were really about. So I'm not really the person to ask. I guess I was a bit lazy and I did the things I had to do, but I didn't spend a lot of time on the platform.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. And one last question. So everybody's moving online in engagement processes at the moment. If you're going to make one recommendation based on your experience of this project, what would you advise people thinking about online processes to do?
I think the size of the group was a good one, because it meant that everyone got a chance to talk. I think, as I said before, I think the quality of the presentations was really critical in keeping us interested. So I think that would be the thing I'd focus on, you know, make sure that you're offering people something that's really compelling, and then they will stick around.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Carolyn. That's really helpful. A compelling offer there. So our next slide, we're on to Q&As. Oops. So have we got some questions there?
I'm not sure that we have. I think everybody's very quiet.
We have a question, yes.
There's one that, Diane, there's one that's from Edward Mallam asking who were the experts.
Okay, who wants to take that?
I'll take that. So we had, in the first group, Carly Kine from the Ada Lovelace Institute spoke. The second week we had Professor Mike Parker from who's from Oxford University, who's a data ethicist, and we also had Peter Wells, who's a data policy consultant. And then in the final plenary we had Natalie Banner from Understanding Patient Data at the Wellcome Trust, and also Renata Sampson, who from the Open Data Institute. So those were our 5 specialists.
Okay, thank you. And with the questions are starting to appear. How did you choose the topic in the first place, and did it feed into actual policy decision making somehow? That's from Eva.
That's a great question. I might pull Rima in on this one. Choosing the topic was one of the trickiest things I think about the process, because we were desperately trying to focus on something that was really relevant, but also wanted to make sure that it would be relevant beyond those 3 weeks when we were talking about it. So it was done with a lot of conversation between the project team, and we wanted to choose something that we thought would still have relevance even if the policy cycle had moved on, so that the ideas we're discussing would still be relevant to other strategies that might be proposed. Rima, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add on that one.
Absolutely. I think this was probably the most challenging aspect of designing the online deliberation, which is the rate at which the policy cycle was moving made it very difficult to say this is exactly what we want to design and run and convene a discussion about, and flexibility and keeping pace with the evolving policy cycle was part of it. However, we knew already that there was a live conversation about the Digital Contact Tracing Act and how it sat within the systems. So being able to point to the tangibility of a conversation out there was really important. Also thinking about how that might fit in to the wider systems, so symptom tracking also, but also potential ways forward in relation to technology was quite interesting. So thinking about its application potentially for public health identity purposes. And more broadly, we already knew from previous discussions convened that the question about what might build or articulate what public confidence looked like in the use of such certain technologies were quite tangible. So we'd already had really rich conversation in the context of health data, citizen juries, and in the context of biometric technologies in relation to facial recognition technology systems. So I don't think that it was easy, and I think that that's one of the big challenges for online public deliberation, which is not so much about online public deliberation, but about when you're doing deliberation in such an evolving context, you may need to, move with the policy cycle, and the questions or the set of questions being asked may evolve, and that's challenging, and that's much harder than maybe at a time when pace of change is not so profound. I hope I've answered that question, or at least said something interesting in the process of answering the question.
I think that's really interesting, and just in terms of thinking about project design, how people design projects like this. And this takes us to our next questions, which are both about process. So Chloe and Fran have asked questions. One is about how the materials development phase, given how quickly things were moving, and making session materials iterative based on previous discussions. And then Fran has asked about online facilitation. Any reflections on the experience of facilitating online?
So I think what we ended up doing is our materials were very simple. So we, in terms of the information sharing, it was primarily through the specialists' presentations, and they were done with simple PowerPoints and verbal presentations, which were then, the slides were then shared in the videos, and we had verbatim note takers who shared the notes as well, so people could then access that in multiple formats. We didn't do any specifically complex activities that required a lot of materials, and we didn't use any additional platforms. So we didn't use a Google Jam or a Miro or Mural or anything like that, because some people were joining on their phones. We basically needed to keep it as simple to participate in as possible. And I think so the discussions, and therefore were very, very verbally led, and that was the advantage of having the chat function as well, so that if people who were less comfortable talking in a group would regularly participate through the chat in a different way. So that was, in terms of the materials development, we kept it as simple as we possibly could, basically. That was also partly due to time pressures. We just didn't have the time to develop complicated materials either. The role of the facilitator and facilitating style, it's a little, I think it's a lot of the same skills. You're drawing on a lot of the same skills. You can pick up some nuance in people's facial expressions, and if you're staying with the same group of participants, you get to know people and you get to see how people respond, and you online, and you can work with them in that way. I think there is definitely a case that it is a little more structured in terms of making sure people have time to speak, and a little less dynamic, and that just takes a bit of adjusting to. Would be my take on that.
Thank you, Anna. So I'm going to ask a very quick question, which should need only a very quick answer, which was, what did it cost, overall cost?
I don't actually know.
Do you want to look that up, Anna, while I ask a different question?
I mean, yes, I might need to just do back of the notepad. Because it was a collaboration though, it wasn't kind of costed for a budget in the same way that other engagement practitioners on the call might be used to doing. So there were the sort of normal costs around thank you payments to participants, there's the cost of the online platform, and then there's cost of time. But I don't as yet have an estimate across all of our organisations as what that was, to be honest. Come back to you maybe.
Okay, so the next couple of questions kind of relate to your points about making things simple because of the need for to get things done quickly because of the time pressures. So so Jake has asked about the extent to which making things simple and accessible was important to the success of the project, but behind this is his kind of real question, which is about online versus face-to-face, I think, or what happens in deliberative processes, and he's described that as the sometimes the magic of deliberate methods is the organized chaos of real people in a room hashing it out.
I'm also conscious I don't necessarily need to be the only one answering this. Rima, did you want to take any? Do you want to answer this, or do you want me to?
You me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I love the organised chaos of deliberative processes. I mean, I think there's two things. Firstly, it's much more organised than people realise, and to get that wonderful description, which is the sort of sense of a group or a room gelling together, requires a lot of planning and thought and preparation. It is, you know, I mean, I think that it's really important to recognise the strengths of face-to-face conversation. You know, the point about people's body language, their interaction, all of these things are really important, and it's hard to replicate that in an online setting. However, there's also some beautiful organised chaos I found through this online process as well. I mean, I was really interested to see how in plenary sessions the Q&A took off. You know, the Zoom group chat Q&A, that was really interesting, and how people almost started to riff off each other's questions when they were talking to or directing questions at the panelists. So that was a really interesting moment where I felt like I started to see in a very different medium the sort of thing that you might see in an offline deliberation. Yeah, I think that we need to recognise that there are limitations and constraints. And of course, my interest is mixed methods, range of different tools and approaches appropriate for very different contexts and scenarios. So, you know, we're looking at a very particular context and very particular scenario. And the kind of question for me, from the perspective of Ada Lovelace Institute, is how do we enable good public engagement to happen at this rather challenging time? And can we design for that? Can we aim to create those moments in a virtual medium? I think we've got a lot still to explore and to learn. I think we're asking the wrong question if we say, how do we replicate what's offline online? I don't think that's the right question. I think the question is, what's the objectives of deliberation, and what can we do using different tools and approaches, and how can they complement each other? But I'd love to hear what people have to say on that in the discussion group. I feel like this is quite a controversial area that I'm venturing into, so I'm not claiming to be the font of wisdom on it.
Okay, I'm going to move us on. There are a lot of questions there's a lot of questions about recruitment and inclusivity, and there's a sort of a gesture as well towards one of the potential solutions to this kind of, at least part of a potential solution to inclusion, which is whose spaces are they? Are we creating spaces and then saying you must come to our space? As we do when we hire venues, or are we going to where people are anyway and having conversations, which you might argue it could be more inclusive, could be less inclusive, depends on the nature of those spaces. But it's over to you now to have a conversation. And the next slide, Lucy, I think has our breakout room question. Yes. So how do we frame deliberative processes on a live social issue, and how can such a process feed into a live policy cycle? So Lucy, is everybody organised into breakout rooms?
Yes, so everybody's in breakout rooms. I will click and send you into your breakout rooms, and I will also copy the questions into the chat so that you've got those to refer to.
And we've got half an hour.